The grocery store was the same as it had been for the past 20 years. Margaret found comfort in its predictability. The rows of neatly stacked produce, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the quiet anonymity of the aisles. Her days, much like her shopping trips, were marked by routine. At 53, she lived alone in the house she once shared with her late husband, her children now scattered across cities and time zones. Life had settled into a predictable rhythm. Coffee in the morning, work at the library, a solitary dinner, and an evening of books or quiet television. It wasn't that she was unhappy, but she couldn't deny the quiet ache of loneliness that lingered at the edges of her existence. That Tuesday was no different. She moved through the aisles with her cart, reaching for a loaf of bread when her hand accidentally collided with someone else's. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said instinctively, glancing up. The man smiled, stepping back with a loaf of bread in hand. "No harm done," he replied. He looked to be in his early 30s with a youthful, easy smile and a warmth in his eyes that caught Margaret off guard. For a moment, she stood frozen, feeling oddly self-conscious under his gaze. He was handsome in a casual, unassuming way, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, his dark hair slightly tousled. "I guess we have similar taste in bread," he joked, holding up the package. Margaret chuckled softly, feeling a faint warmth rise to her cheeks. "It's the best one they have," she replied, surprised by her own ease. "Good to know I'm making the right choice," he said. Then, as if sensing her lingering hesitation, he extended his hand. "I'm Ethan, by the way." Margaret hesitated for a heartbeat before taking his hand. "Margaret." "It's nice to meet you, Margaret," he said, his tone genuine. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he nodded and walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart beating a little faster than it had in years. That evening, as she unpacked her groceries, her mind drifted back to Ethan. It was such a small, ordinary interaction, and yet it had left an unexpected warmth in its wake. For the first time in a long time, Margaret found herself looking forward to her next trip to the store. Margaret found herself back at the grocery store sooner than usual. She convinced herself it was for a few things she'd forgotten. Some tea, a bag of apples, but deep down she hoped to see Ethan again. It felt ridiculous, almost juvenile, yet she couldn't shake the small spark of excitement that had been absent from her life for so long. Pushing her cart down the produce aisle, she was startled by a familiar voice. "Margaret!" She turned to see Ethan, a basket slung over his arm, a smile lighting up his face. "We meet again," he said, stepping closer. Margaret smiled, her heart skipping an unexpected beat. "I suppose we do. Still going for the same bread?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Actually, I thought I'd branch out this time. Trying to keep things interesting." Their conversation flowed easily as they walked through the store together. He told her about his job as a freelance photographer, the way he loved capturing fleeting moments of beauty in everyday life. She shared bits about her work at the library and how books had always been her escape. "You must have some great recommendations then," he said as they reached the checkout lanes. "I might," she replied with a small smile. "Do you read much?" "I try to. But I trust a librarian's pick over my random choices any day," he said, his voice warm. "Maybe you could give me a list sometime." Margaret hesitated. It felt strange, this burgeoning connection with someone so much younger, but she couldn't deny the way it lightened something inside her. "Sure," she said softly. Over the next few weeks, their paths seemed to cross often, at the store, at a nearby cafe, once even on a walk through the park. Each meeting felt like an invitation to a world she hadn't realized she missed, a world of laughter, shared stories, and the simple joy of companionship. One evening, as they sat on a park bench, Ethan handed her his phone to show her some of his photos. She admired a picture of a rain-soaked street, the puddles shimmering under a lamppost. "You see the world differently," she said, her voice tinged with awe. He glanced at her, his smile soft. "And you remind me that there's still so much to learn about it." The words lingered in the air, and Margaret felt the faintest stirring of something she wasn't ready to name. Their connection, once casual, was becoming something deeper, something she hadn't expected but couldn't bring herself to resist. The evening breeze drifted through Margaret's open window as she sat at her kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea cradled in her hands. Her mind was far from the book she'd been trying to read. Instead, It replayed the sound of Ethan's laughter, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his work, and the warmth that lingered long after their conversations ended. It had started as a curiosity, a novelty in her otherwise predictable days. But now, sitting alone, she couldn't deny the truth taking root in her heart. This was more than just friendship. Margaret set down her tea, her hands trembling slightly. "What are you doing?" she asked herself, shaking her head. He was young, vibrant, with his whole life ahead of him. She was 53, with silver streaks in her hair, and a past filled with regrets she rarely spoke about. It felt impossible, even foolish, to think someone like Ethan could see her as anything more than a kind companion. But then she thought of the way he listened, really listened when she spoke. How he remembered the smallest details about her favorite books or the way she liked her coffee. How he'd catch her off guard with his jokes, his playful teasing, and the genuine interest in her life that no one had shown her in years. The moment of realization had been subtle yet undeniable. It was during their last conversation, sitting in the cafe. Ethan had leaned closer, his voice lowering as he shared a memory of his childhood, and she'd felt an inexplicable pull toward him. A yearning she hadn't felt since her youth, buried under decades of routine and solitude. Now, that yearning filled her with equal parts exhilaration and fear. She paced the kitchen, her thoughts racing. What would he think if he knew? Would he laugh? Or worse, would he pity me? Margaret pressed her hands to her face, trying to calm the storm inside. She couldn't remember the last time she'd let herself feel so vulnerable, so exposed. And yet, even with the fear, there was an undeniable spark of joy. Ethan had reminded her of something she thought she'd lost forever, a part of herself that could still hope, still dream. As the night deepened, Margaret made a silent vow. Whatever happened, she wouldn't let fear rob her of this newfound light. Even if her feelings went unspoken, even if nothing came of them, she would cherish the way he made her feel, alive, in a way she hadn't felt in years. For now, she decided that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't escape. The joy she felt in Ethan's company was intoxicating, but it came hand in hand with a deep, gnawing doubt. In the quiet hours of the night, her mind would betray her, painting vivid pictures of rejection, judgment, and ridicule. She could hear the whispers of society's disapproval. "What is she thinking?" they'd say. "A woman her age, with a man so much younger." Margaret couldn't help but replay those imagined conversations. The thought of her friends' raised eyebrows or her children's uncomfortable silences made her stomach twist. She loved her grown kids fiercely, and the idea of alienating them with her choices filled her with dread. But then there was Ethan. With every shared laugh and every thoughtful glance, he seemed to chip away at her defenses. He made her feel seen in a way that no one had in years. Not just for her wisdom or her stories, but for her quirks, her thoughts, her very being. Yet, the distance between her hopes and reality felt like an unbridgeable chasm. Margaret couldn't ignore the age difference. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about lived experiences, the weight of the past, and the uncertainties of the future. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums, she lingered on a picture of herself at Ethan's age. She barely recognized the young woman smiling back at her, full of dreams, unburdened by the complexities of life. What would that version of herself think of her now? Margaret let out a heavy sigh and closed the album. She couldn't deny that she felt more alive now at 53 than she had in years. And yet, the vulnerability terrified her. It was easier to hide behind the veneer of friendship, to pretend her feelings didn't exist, than to risk losing the connection altogether. One evening, Ethan called unexpectedly. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm and familiar, "I was wondering if you'd like to go for a walk tomorrow. It's supposed to be sunny, and there's this park I think you'd love." Her heart leapt, even as her inner critic whispered its doubts. "You'll only make a fool of yourself." But she silenced the voice, forcing herself to focus on the invitation rather than the implications. "That sounds lovely," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. As she hung up the phone, Margaret realized something important. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she couldn't let fear dictate her life anymore. If nothing else, she owed it to herself to see where the spark might take her, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The walk in the park had been everything Margaret hoped for, simple, warm, and filled with laughter. Ethan had a way of making her feel at ease, as though time itself paused in his presence. As they strolled beneath the golden leaves of autumn, she felt a longing she hadn't dared to acknowledge before. That night, as she sipped her tea, Margaret mulled over her next step. She'd spent too many nights analyzing her feelings, torn between excitement and fear. But something about their day together made her realize she couldn't keep her emotions locked away forever. If she wanted to truly understand what they had, she needed to take a leap. The idea of inviting Ethan to her home both thrilled and terrified her. Her cozy little house was her sanctuary, filled with memories of a life lived long before him. Letting him into that space felt like crossing a line, one that might blur the boundaries she'd carefully maintained. Margaret thought about how to make the invitation seem natural. A casual dinner, perhaps. She imagined him sitting at her kitchen table, his laughter echoing off the walls. The image warmed her, but her doubts were quick to follow. What if it's too much? What if he misinterprets my intentions? Or worse, doesn't reciprocate my feelings at all? Pacing the living room, Margaret debated the logistics of cooking for two. She hadn't prepared a meal for anyone other than herself in years. The thought of chopping vegetables and setting the table with someone else in mind felt oddly exhilarating. Finally, she picked up her phone and sent a message. "Hi, Ethan. I was thinking. I've been trying out this new recipe and wondered if you'd like to come by for dinner sometime. No pressure, of course. Just thought it might be nice." Her thumb hovered over the send button for a moment before she tapped it. The reply came almost instantly. "I'd love to, Margaret. Just tell me when." Her breath caught, and a mix of relief and nerves washed over her. It was set. She had taken the first step, no matter how small, toward something unknown. As she began planning the evening, Margaret felt a strange but welcome shift. For the first time in years, her home didn't feel like just a place to retreat. It was about to become a space of possibility, where her heart might finally be brave enough to speak its truth. The day Ethan came over, Margaret spent hours preparing. She moved through her kitchen with a nervous energy, chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, and setting the table with care. Every gesture felt significant, a piece of her heart being woven into the evening's preparations. The house smelled of garlic, fresh herbs, and something sweet. Maybe it was the delicate anticipation that lingered in the air. When the doorbell rang, her heart skipped a beat. She wiped her hands on the towel, took a deep breath, and opened the door to find Ethan standing there, his smile wide, his eyes bright. He was holding a small bouquet of wildflowers in one hand, the colors almost as vibrant as his personality. "I thought I'd bring something," he said, stepping into the doorway. Margaret took the flowers, her fingers brushing his briefly, and felt a rush of warmth. "They're lovely," she said, her voice a little more breathless than she intended. "Thank you." Ethan glanced around the room, taking in the flickering candles on the table and the cozy ambience Margaret had created. "It looks amazing in here," he remarked, his voice soft with admiration. They settled at the table, the hum of conversation filling the air. They spoke about everything and nothing. About the weather, about books they both loved, about fleeting memories from childhood that suddenly felt important to share. Margaret was struck by how easily the conversation flowed, how natural and unforced it all seemed. It wasn't the awkward dance of two strangers trying to find their footing. It was the connection of two souls who had somehow been waiting to find each other. As the meal progressed, Margaret couldn't help but notice the way Ethan's eyes lingered on her. There was a softness there, a tenderness that made her stomach flutter. Her pulse quickened as she caught him looking at her in a way that felt different from their past interactions, more deliberate, more meaningful. The conversation eventually slowed, the only sound in the room the soft clink of silverware against plates. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. "This was really nice," he said, his voice low. "I'm glad we did this." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. The simplicity of the moment felt like a turning point, like they had crossed some invisible line. Her emotions, which had been simmering quietly beneath the surface, surged now, stronger than ever before. She wasn't sure what this was, or what it meant, but she could feel the pull between them like gravity, irresistible and powerful. She met his gaze, unsure of what to say, but the words came anyway. I'm glad you came. I've enjoyed spending time with you. Ethan's lips curved into a smile, one that was warm and knowing. I've enjoyed it too, Margaret. More than I expected. The air seemed to thicken with the unspoken. Margaret's heart raced, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew in that moment that something had shifted between them. It was subtle but undeniable. The way he looked at her now was different, as though he saw her not just as a woman much older than him, but as someone who mattered, who had something important to offer. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the wine glass at the same time, and this time, neither of them pulled away. The contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt of electricity through Margaret. She looked down, embarrassed by how quickly her heart had begun to race. Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice quiet and almost tender. You know, he said, you're not what I expected. Margaret smiled a little nervously. Oh, and what did you expect? He chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling. I don't know. Maybe someone more guarded. Someone who's harder to talk to. He paused, and she caught the sincerity in his eyes. But you're easy to talk to. You're real. The words lingered between them, and Margaret felt her cheeks warm. It was as if, in those few sentences, he had seen straight into her soul. The parts of her she had hidden away for so long. The parts she didn't know if anyone could truly understand. Ethan sat back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. He took a deep breath, his fingers lightly drumming on the edge of his glass. I know there's a lot of space between us, Margaret. In years, I mean. But I don't think it matters. Margaret's heart fluttered at the weight of his words. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge the fear, the doubts she had been carrying, but for now the silence was enough. The warmth between them spoke louder than anything she could say. Tonight wasn't about labels or expectations. It was about a moment, shared between two people who hadn't expected to find each other, but who, for reasons neither of them fully understood, now couldn't seem to let go. As the evening wore on, the connection between them deepened. The conversation slowed, and the room fell into a comfortable quiet, but the space between them felt charged, alive with possibility. Margaret wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the past and open her heart to what was right in front of her. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself lost in thought, her mind drifting between the present and memories of the past. Ethan had gone home not long before, leaving her standing in her kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. The leftover wine in her glass caught the light from the dim lamps, casting a soft glow on the table where they had sat, sharing meals, laughter, and something else, something that had, perhaps, only just begun. She wiped down the table slowly, her movements almost absent, as her mind churned over the evening's moments. She couldn't help but think about what Ethan had said about the space between them. The age gap, the expectations of society. It was all so heavy in her mind. The words felt like an anchor she couldn't escape, pulling her back to the doubt that had once kept her locked in solitude. But as she stood there, the kitchen now quieter than it had been all night, a shift occurred within her. She was no longer afraid of that gap. It no longer seemed like a chasm separating them. Instead, it felt like a bridge, a space to be crossed, not with hesitation or fear, but with the willingness to understand each other, to take the time to learn who they truly were beyond numbers or judgments. In the soft, gentle light of the evening, Margaret realized something important. Love, real love, didn't have a time stamp. It didn't care about age, about the years that had passed or the ones yet to come. Love simply was. It was the way Ethan made her feel seen, made her feel like she mattered, in a way she hadn't felt in years. It was the laughter they shared, the small gestures of kindness, the way their hands had brushed so many times over the course of the evening, like an unspoken promise. Margaret had spent so many years afraid of being judged, afraid of what others might think. But now, she wasn't so sure that mattered. What mattered was the connection, the quiet but undeniable spark between her and Ethan. It was in the way their words flowed so easily, the way his presence had turned her once lonely home into a place of warmth, of possibility. She leaned against the counter, the evening's thoughts spinning in her mind, and felt the stirrings of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Maybe she didn't need to fear age or time or society's expectations. Maybe, just maybe, she could embrace this. Embrace him. Embrace herself. The quiet comfort of her home felt different now. It felt less like a place of solitude and more like a place of potential. The moments with Ethan had shown her a side of herself she hadn't seen in years. The side that was open, that was willing to experience life again. To step outside the boundaries she had so carefully constructed around herself. Margaret closed her eyes, her hand resting on the edge of the sink, and let out a long, steady breath. She had spent so much of her life thinking she had missed her chance at love, that it was something reserved for the young, the vibrant, the ones who hadn't yet seen the weight of time on their shoulders. But she now understood that love had no expiration date. It was something that could bloom at any age, in any season of life, as long as one was willing to let it. She looked out the window, her eyes meeting the darkening sky, and smiled. In that quiet moment, Margaret knew that this love wasn't bound by time. It wasn't a fleeting thing. It was something enduring, something that could grow and deepen, regardless of how many years separated them. In that moment, she understood what it meant to truly live, to truly feel alive again. And it wasn't just the idea of love that excited her. It was the feeling of being seen, of being wanted, of being part of something real. It wasn't about youth. It was about the courage to love, to embrace what life had to offer, no matter how unexpected or unconventional it might be. Margaret had spent far too many years wondering if it was too late. Now she knew the truth. Love was never too late. It was always just waiting for her to take the first step. And, for the first time in a long time, she was ready. Ready to let go of the fear. Ready to embrace this new chapter. Ready to love. The weeks that followed were filled with moments of quiet clarity for Margaret. Each day, as she went about her routine, she carried with her a newfound sense of purpose, a sense of warmth that wasn't there before. The days had a different rhythm now, one that included texts from Ethan, spontaneous phone calls, and the occasional quiet moments spent with him, savoring the simple joy of being together. Margaret had found something more than love. She had found a deep connection with another human being, one that was rooted in understanding, trust, and most unexpectedly of all, acceptance. Ethan had never once made her feel self-conscious about her age. His eyes never seemed to see anything but her. The woman with a heart full of stories, of life lived fully, of love not bound by the rules others might impose. It was in those moments of shared laughter, of quiet companionship, that she had come to realize the truest form of love wasn't about following the right steps or meeting some societal expectation. It was about feeling seen for who you truly were and accepting someone else for who they were as well. She smiled as she thought about how everything had changed. Her life, once a routine of quiet monotony, had blossomed into something rich with possibility. Her heart, once weary from years of solitude, now beat with anticipation. Margaret no longer feared the judgments of others. She didn't need to. She had long ago learned the lesson that love was something for everyone, at every age, no matter the circumstances. It wasn't about the years you had behind you, but the ones you still had ahead of you. It was about living fully in the present, embracing what was before you, and holding tight to the joy that each new moment brought. One evening, as she stood at the window, watching the sun set over the quiet street, she received another text from Ethan. It was a simple message, an invitation to meet up for dinner. But as she read the words, something shifted in her. She didn't hesitate this time, didn't overthink or worry about what others might think. She knew the answer instantly. She had already made her decision. Love had no expiration date. It wasn't about age or expectation. It was about the connection that flourished between two people, the moments that sparked joy, and the courage to embrace what felt right, even when it defied convention. Margaret took a deep breath, her heart light and full. She typed her response, her fingers dancing across the screen with a confidence she hadn't known she had. And as she sent the message, she smiled to herself, knowing that love, true love, could be found at any stage of life. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And in this new chapter of her life, she had discovered that love, the kind that made your heart sing, was something to be cherished, no matter the age, no matter the obstacles. The power of love was that it was limitless. It transcended time, defied expectations, and bloomed in the most unexpected of places. As she closed her phone and stood by the window, the sunset bathed her in a warm glow. Margaret knew she was ready for whatever came next. The future, once uncertain, now seemed full of promise. The journey ahead was hers to take, and she would take it with courage, with love, and with the certainty that no matter her age, love was always worth pursuing. And so she did. With every step she took, with every laugh she shared, Margaret embraced the truth: love at any stage was worth it. And she would never let that truth go.